If you would please turn your Bibles to Exodus chapter 1. That'll be our text this morning. Have you ever done the thing where a new season of a show comes out, a show that you've been watching in the past, and you're very excited about the new season of the show, and so you start episode 1 of the next season, and then you start watching it, and you realize you don't remember enough of the last season to follow what's going on in the new season? Okay, I've several times, we'll start a new season of a show, and I'm like, okay, Rachel, who's that guy, and why is that girl doing this, and where is everybody, right? There's been numerous times we've had to go back and watch previous episodes from the last season in order for us to remember enough in order to watch the new season that's just been released. Okay, how many of you have ever done that? Okay, I'm glad to know that I am not alone in that, and that makes me feel better. All right, this morning we are starting a new series on the life of Moses, and as you start just in verse 1, chapter 1 of Exodus 1, it is immediately apparent that we are now in season 2. And if you don't remember the way season 1 ended and how everything happened, you can get lost pretty quickly. None of Exodus makes sense unless you just finished reading Genesis. Okay, in fact, the first word of the book of Exodus in Hebrew almost always goes untranslated because chapter 1, verse 1 starts with the word and. Okay, it's assuming you just finished reading what goes before. Okay, notice how it starts. It says, and these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. All right, 70 is the perfect number. This is the number of completion. We read God has sent the perfect number of Israelites down to Egypt. Okay, and we're supposed to remember from Genesis the reason that all of these descendants of Jacob went down to Egypt. Okay, you remember the story. There was a famine throughout the whole land. We didn't know how we were going to survive, but God provided through dreams to Joseph the revelation that there will be this famine. So for 7 years, Joseph stores all the grain in Egypt so that when the years of famine come, Joseph can save the entire world from starvation. Okay, because of this, Joseph is raised to be the second most powerful man in the world. Okay, Egypt is the mightiest nation. Joseph is number 2 in command. Genesis ends on a great high note, God's provision through his people. Verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Right, I can't tell you exactly how long goes between verses 5 and verses 7 in Exodus, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 centuries. Okay, it's a long time. That's significant, and we'll come back to that. And also, you notice here it tells us they were fruitful and multiplied. Okay, that matters. You remember back at the very beginning of Genesis, God gives the very first command to his people, and what's the first command given to Adam and Eve? He says, go out, be fruitful, and multiply. Okay, we read Exodus 1, we say the people are doing that. Good job, you're following what God has commanded. Not only that, but when Pharaoh then will oppose it, who's he really opposing? Okay, he's opposing the commandments of God himself. Verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Okay, and again, if 400 years have transpired, you can see why he wouldn't remember Joseph. Verse 9, look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. All right, now we get to the main conflict that will occupy all of season 2 of this grand story. Okay, we have to deal with all of these foreigners living in Egypt. Okay, and Pharaoh's not just being paranoid. This is a reasonable fear. It is reasonable for him to fear that the Israelites will be a threat to his power if they are in the majority. Okay, Pharaoh lives in a world where might makes right, and so if the Israelites outnumber the Egyptians, it's very reasonable to assume that that would come at his expense. So he's got to deal with this. How's he going to do that? Okay, and we won't take the time to read it, but the rest of chapter 1 is detailing the 3 ways that Pharaoh tries to deal with this Israelite problem. Okay, how do we solve all of these Israelites multiplying faster than we do? Okay, and the first thing he does is he tries to make all of them slaves. He says, if I work them hard enough, they will learn their place, and not only that, but it can slow their growth. Okay, and Pharaoh is partially successful through this, right? He does make all of the Israelites slaves. Of course, the problem is God continues to bless them. They continue to grow. They continue to multiply. Didn't work. So now we got to go to step 2. In step 2, Pharaoh tells the Hebrew midwives, he says, here's what I want you to do. Okay, every time you deliver a Hebrew baby boy, you need to kill it, right? But let the girls live. Right? And he knows biology well enough to know if you get rid of enough baby boys, you can greatly curtail the population of the Israelites. Okay, but the midwives won't do it. They go to Pharaoh and they say, Pharaoh, we tried, but every time we get there, the women have already given birth because these Hebrew women are so strong, they don't even need a midwife. Okay, they lie through their teeth to Pharaoh because they know that they can't obey this awful, awful commandment. Okay, so finally we end chapter 1 with Pharaoh's final strategy. He says, okay, this isn't working, so what we're going to do is we're going to take every baby boy, I don't care when he was born, if we find a baby boy, we're going to throw it into the Nile River. Right? And this is awful. This is brutal. Okay, the text is inviting you to put yourself in the shoes of these people. Imagine what it would be like if you were a young parent, childbearing age, and your wife got pregnant, the terror that would be in your mind until that child was born, not knowing if it's going to be a boy or a girl, not knowing if Pharaoh is going to kill your child or not. Okay? This is mortifying. There is no redeeming quality of Pharaoh in the story. Okay, Pharaoh is the most brutal kind of tyrant. We can't feel sorry for anything that happens to Pharaoh after this, right? He deserves everything and more that will happen in the rest of the story. Okay, that's Exodus chapter 1. Okay, so what do we do with that, right? Why do we care about this story almost 4,000 years later? What's the point for us? What do we get out of any of this? Why do we need to learn it? Okay, in the first place, and if you're taking notes, this is the first thing to write down. That is, that Exodus is the continuation of the covenant story. Okay, I cannot emphasize this enough. Exodus is the continuation of God's covenant story. Okay, we've already talked about how this is season 2 of a story that will have many seasons. Okay, but this isn't just any story, this is the story. Okay, I contend that if you have to summarize the Bible into one thing, the Bible is about the covenant. God makes a covenant with His people. The entire story of Scripture is about how God will keep that covenant with His people. The Bible is about the covenant. Okay, and at the end of Genesis, we could mostly say that God had fulfilled the covenant. Right? By the end of Genesis, God has given them a numerous people. There's 70 of them. It's the perfect number of people. Okay, God has given them a promised land. He came to Abraham and said, this land is yours. I am giving it to you and your descendants. Okay, we've also had the blessing that's been given to the entire world through these people. Joseph saved the world from starvation. Okay, God has fulfilled the covenant by the end of Genesis. Okay, but there's a problem. Right? The problem is we've got this promised land that's supposed to belong to the Israelites, but by the time we get to Exodus 1, that land is full of other people, and the Israelites are all down in Egypt. Okay, how is God going to fulfill this covenant? How is God going to get this people out of Egypt and into the promised land? And how is God possibly going to end the slavery that these people are stuck in? Okay, we've got to fix it, because it's about the covenant. All right, 2 thoughts on the covenant story and why it matters to us. And the first thing is this. This is the sub-point A, if you're taking notes, and that is that this is our story. Right? If you are a Christian and you're reading Exodus without thinking, well, this is what happened to our people, okay, then you're reading it wrong. That's as blunt as I can be. This is supposed to be us reading it saying, this is what happened to our ancestors long ago in Egypt. We were slaves in Egypt. We waited centuries for God to act for our redemption. Again, I get impatient when I pray for something and then 2 days later God hasn't solved it yet, right? These people, generations of people were born, lived, and died waiting for, praying for God's redemption, and they never saw it, but they kept faith because they knew who God was and they knew that it would happen in His time. Does God act? Yes. Is it always the way we want Him to? No. Okay, but more importantly, this story sets the entire tone for how we are supposed to see ourselves as God's people. How do we look in the mirror and see ourselves? Well, we're supposed to see ourselves as the people who used to be in slavery, but God, through His mighty power, redeemed us. Okay, that is the core of who our identity is supposed to be. Okay, how we view ourselves matters. It matters tremendously. Our self-identity is as the redeemed covenant people of God. Okay, how do we see ourselves? Psychologists will tell us, and your own experience tells us, that if you see yourself as attractive, you will actually appear more attractive to other people. Okay? Part of the reason I'm so good looking is because I know I'm so good looking at others, right? That's part of how it works. If you see yourself as a victim, you will act like a victim. If you see yourself as skilled or smart or clumsy or slow, you will act more like the trait that you see in yourself. Your self-identity, what you perceive when you are looking in that mirror, matters a lot. Okay, there's a very famous saying, I don't know who said it, but it's whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Right? I read a very interesting article this week on emotional intelligence. Okay, that's a really trendy topic. You can find lots of articles about that right now. But the article said that psychologists know that one of the most important components of emotional intelligence and the corresponding success in life, because people with high emotional intelligence tend to do a lot better in the world, but one of the central components to that is self-confidence. And the problem, though, often occurs that people who are good at life then fall into the temptation of arrogance, which then stunts their potential. Okay, and so the article goes on to talk about how do you trick yourself into having greater self-confidence, but yet not overdo it to the point that you become arrogant and start running over people, which will then stunt your growth. Okay, in other words, the article was saying if you want to be really successful, you need to think highly of yourself, but don't think too highly of yourself or else you'll fall over. Okay, but I argue you don't have to trick yourself to get your confidence, and you don't need strategies for overcoming arrogance. What you need to do is understand your story. Okay, I think if we understand our central identity, our foundational story for who we are, this will take care of itself. Okay, you need confidence in your life. Remember that God loved you so much that He broke the powers of this world so that we could be in a relationship to Him. Okay, our confidence, our source of strength, doesn't come from within us. It comes from our relationship to the God who saved us. Okay, you are deeply loved. That is the source of your confidence. Okay, also, what does that do to your arrogance? Okay, well, it's real hard to be arrogant if the way that I got saved, the way that I got my redemption, didn't come from me, but it came from God outside of me. Right? We have to remember our story. The reason that you have success is because God's power got you there. Our core identity is as the redeemed people of God's covenant. And I think if we will embrace that, if we will view ourselves as those people, then that sets us up for everything else we need to do in life. Is that fair? All right. Letter B. Not only is this our story, but this is God's story. We're going to talk about this a lot more as we go deeper into Exodus, but I want to get this on the table now. Okay, the main battle that happens in Exodus is not between Pharaoh and Moses. Okay, the battle in Exodus is between the God-King Pharaoh, who sits in control of the most powerful nation on earth, and the God of Israel, who will have a battle between the gods. And in the story, we get to find out which God really has power, which God is really worthy of our worship, and which God really can save. All right, and I don't want to ruin the ending for you, but it's the God of Israel. All right? You've seen the movie, right? All right. This is God's story. All right, number 2. Exodus also teaches us about godly leadership. Okay, again, I said this is one of my study topics. I figured a good place to go to learn about leadership would be the book of Exodus, specifically in the life of Moses. And you notice from the very first words, Exodus is teaching us what real leadership looks like. Notice verse 15. It says, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, 'When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that a baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live.' The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned them and asked them, 'Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?' The midwives answered Pharaoh, 'Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive.' So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own." All right, again, a study of leadership I think is especially appropriate this morning as we just lined up 14 deacons and said this is what leaders look like for the GCC family. Okay, so what does Exodus teach us about real leadership? And I think one of the most striking things about this text is that we know the names of the midwives. Okay, these two ladies were named Shiphrah and Puah. We know that, the text tells us that. But it doesn't bother naming for us the leader of the most powerful nation on earth. Okay, we know it's Pharaoh, but we don't know which Pharaoh this is. Okay, the text largely considers that unimportant. Okay, in God's mind, who's more important? 2 midwives or the king of the world? It's the 2 midwives. Okay, Pharaoh is the boss of thousands and thousands of people. Okay, but I would contend that the better leaders in the story are Shiphrah and Puah. I think real power resides in common women acting with courage and integrity, not in the most powerful man in the world acting out of fear and selfishness. All right, here's my point. If you get just one thing out of this morning, this is a good thing to get. And that is that leadership is not telling people what to do. It's leading in righteousness. Right? And I think our culture gets this wrong a lot. I think typically what our culture thinks is that leadership is about being in charge. Okay, and if you have the power and the authority to tell people what to do, then that makes you a leader. Okay, I would contend that being able to tell people what to do might make you a boss, but it doesn't make you a leader. Okay, I think our world has too many bosses and not enough leaders. That make sense? Like many of you, I've had experience working for both, right? There have been times in my life where I just had bosses. There's other times in my life where I've had leaders. Who would you rather work for? Every time, right? One of the many reasons that we like Martin Luther King is because he was not a boss, he was a leader. Okay, he had a great quote that I think applies to this. Saw this week in honor of Martin Luther King Day. And that is that the time is always right to do what is right. And if you'll live by that, you're much more likely to be a leader rather than just a boss. You know, I really like the story of Shiphrah and Puah because they were willing to stand up for what was right, no matter what the consequences were. And again, I think we need more leaders like them. We need less bosses. Okay, so the point then for us is, I don't know what level of authority you have in your life. I don't know, you may have a whole bunch of people that you get to boss around at work, or you may be the lowest person on the totem pole and you take orders from everybody else. Okay, but that's really irrelevant as far as your leadership is concerned. Okay? You don't have to be the boss to be a leader. Not many of us will be bosses, okay, but all of us can be leaders. Fair enough? All right. Again, what we're trying to do with all of this is we're trying to model our lives after Jesus. What does it look like for us not to seek to be served, but to serve other people? At the end of the day, if we can look more like Jesus, that's really what it's all about. So at this time in our service, we're going to sing a few verses of an invitation song. During the singing of this song, I will be down front. One of our shepherds will be down front. We would love to talk with you or pray with you about anything that's going on in your life. If you have a need, please come during this next song. Before we sing that, though, I'd like to close us with a word of blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. May the Lord be gracious to you and give you peace. Let's stand and sing.